Everybody Hates Rand is a Wheel of Time podcast that will contain spoilers for all 14 books. So if you're anti-spoiler, stop this, read all 14 books, and come back. We'll be here, waiting.
Our title is a joke and is meant to be taken as such. Everybody in this context refers to us and our cats. You are free to feel however you want about Rand. He's a fictional character. Please don't DM us.
The world is a mess, Dark One stretching out his hand. The dragon's reborn, the fire's been fanned, but everybody hates Rand. Everybody hates Rand. Everybody hates Rand.
Mr. Jordan had soul.
Oh, yeah, for real.
I was really hoping that would get a kick.
It was Sally just sat down with what I assumed to be a normal glass of soda, but I wasn't looking because I was opening Audacity. And I turned to her just as she lifted up the glass, which is a Rainforest Cafe novelty cup, to turn on the light at the bottom. It goes through, so far it seems to be red, white, and blue, which is dispiriting.
Yeah, it's not very fun, but
oh man, that got me. It's perfect too because the vibes are so off not having a book to talk about.
Tears are running down my face right now. Yeah, the vibes are weird.
Oh, God, I should have got, like, a novelty glass.
You're right, this is technically a gift I gave Emily, and I took it for the bit. So
No,
do you want this?
no,
Should
I
I have this?
Our Rainforest
Yes,
Cafe
exactly.
novelty cup. No, I want you to have it, and I can gaze upon it in...
Look at it makes a thing at the bottom, like a...
What the fuck?
It's like a tiger's eye, and it says the Rainforest
it says
Cafe.
Rainforest Cafe.
Yeah.
Hey, guys.
I know, they're really doing the most.
It's exactly what I wanted from this episode. So far.
Yay!
Everything's perfect. You guys, this is Everybody Hates Rand, your friendly neighborhood Wheelie Time podcast. I'm Emily Jushaw.
And I'm Sally Goodger.
And for the first time, besides perhaps some weird Q&A episodes here and there, we don't have chapters to summarize.
Yeah.
Which is very odd.
Yeah, it does feel weird. I feel very unanchored.
Yeah, like normally I can get through it. I've always sort of told myself, like, even in the worst episodes that we've done, we have at least been summarizing Wheelie Time in a somewhat amusing way.
Yeah, exactly.
And now we don't even have that. So
no. All we have is this Rainforest Cafe glass.
All we have is the Rainforest Cafe glass and our own personalities.
Yeah. Ugh, nothing to hide behind.
I know. In November, it doesn't feel like I have a personality.
Oh my god, so true, bestie.
It's like, hey, seasonal depression is setting in.
It is getting dark at 2:45 p.m.
Yeah.
And
I'll be like, wow, I can't believe it's midnight. And then I look at the clock and it's 5:45 p.m. Yeah. And I'm like, hey.
Surely I need to be hibernating like a bear.
This can't be happening. But we've done it. We've talked about every Wheel of Time book, all of them. Didn't skip any of them.
We talked all 14 of them.
All 14 books. We've talked all 14 books.
But yeah, we've done it. We finished A Memory of Light 2 weeks ago now, give or take. The last episode, if you happen to be listening sort of back to back. And that feels weird, but we took some time to kind of reflect on the series, and we have some kind of discussion topics about Wheel of Time, and Emily gave... Sorry, Dibble looks... You can just see the void if you look deep enough into his eyes.
There go the tumbleweeds.
Yeah, Emily put together a great structure for us to talk about, which I think is really good, about what makes any particular book and book series successful and kind of given us some bullet points to think through for Wheel of Time specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting because having done it all, I feel like the question becomes at the end of the project, okay, was this worth it?
Yeah.
And that's a question regarding the project itself that only we can answer, I guess, but regarding the book regarding the book series that we're talking about, that also seems like the obvious conclusion to reach. Like, was this, what mark has this book series left on the world?
Yeah.
Was it worth discussing for 7 years? Was, it, like, the grip that it holds on people, you know?
Yeah.
So, and I really, like, I framed it when I was thinking about it as, how is this series successful? And I find I'm really uncomfortable with that term despite being the one to use it, because success is something I just naturally now think of in terms of, like, corporate capitalism, where it's just profit, profit, profit. And that's definitely a facet of whether a book is successful or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does it have a profit, especially in this day and age? But I also can't think of a better word to replace it.
Yeah. I hear you. Success seems like the only right word for me as well, because like the further you get away from that word, the like more you get into moralizing stuff, like was it good? Was it bad? Like did it, but success, we can sort of think of it as like what goals did it accomplish? What marks did it meet? Kind of like Emily was talking about. So yeah, it's a weird one to use, but I think this is a good enough jumping off point for us to talk about it as a commercial success, which Wheel of Time very much is. I was really curious earlier and looked it up, and this is not like, it was a larger number than I expected, but it probably shouldn't have been, that Wheel of Time has sold, as of May or July, I can't quite remember, 2023, over 100 million copies, which is a lot of books.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the, according to Wikipedia, that makes it one of the most best-selling epic fantasy series since Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Now, epic fantasy itself is a pretty niche genre, so if you're gonna, like, create a ranking of them, then there's only really, like, 10 titles on the list anyway, but...
Sure.
It is still, that's quite a lot of copies.
It is quite a lot of copies, and it's very interesting to put it in the context of, like, best-selling since Lord of the Rings, you know, like Lord of the Rings, as if you're interested, you can check us talking about Fellowship of the Ring over on our Patreon podcast. We don't watch Outlander, but holds such, like, a pinnacle of epic fantasy still, commercially and sort of, like, what's the other word I want? Kind of artistically is kind of the only word I can think of.
Aesthetically.
Yeah, that's probably a better word.
Yeah, and Wheel of Time, very obviously, as we've talked about so often, draws so many of its cues from Lord of the Rings, intentionally, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, like, been nominated for awards, it's been on bestseller lists, blah, 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 blah. So externally, like, if we're gonna go for external markers of success, then it has commercially been a success. The entire series, especially as the series wrapped up. I'm always curious. I haven't read anything one way or another, but I am curious about whether readership increased once Brandon Sanderson signed on, or if it decreased and you know, there were some Robert Jordan purists out there who were like, I'll just
stop.
I'll just let it lie where it is.
Yeah, so commercially, he did it. Robert Jordan / Brandon Sanderson did it. I think it's worth just always mentioning, like, there are specific reasons that books like Wheel of Time get picked up by publishing houses and also get marketed by publishing houses. You know, it's written by an old white man, as we'll talk about, does not deviate that much from the Lord of the Rings format of epic fantasy. So one of Emily's questions is where it's pushing the genre, but and it also doesn't ultimately do a ton to sort of push on the values held by the world at large. So it is, in those ways, also very marketable and sellable book series.
Yeah, I think for its time especially, hit a lot of the, like, marketability things, in that it was so easily comparable to things like Lord of the Rings that people were craving.
Yeah.
In the 90s when Wheel of Time was sort of at its peak.
Yeah.
There's also some, like, nepotism involved. Not just that Jordan's wife was an editor at Tor, but I think, like, Tor kind of started and Wheel of Time was one of its, like,
Yeah.
first book series.
One of its big titles.
Which, of course, then those two things feed off each other in terms of success. Robert Jordan's success increases Tor's success generally. But, like, the fact that you have a publisher friend who's willing to keep publishing your incredibly long series, both in terms of book length and in terms of series length, is something that almost no author these days is going to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Based sheerly on, like, the costs of printing.
Yeah, and I was thinking about it earlier. It must have been so weird to be, like, an adult in, like, the 1950s, 60s, or even 70s when you're, like, Lord of the Rings is just come out and you've just read it, and then there's just, like, no other fantasy books to read.
Yeah.
You're just like, okay, well, that literally changed the fabric of me as a person, and then I have to go, like, find, like, pulp books somewhere. There's just, like,
Conan
you can't...
the Barbarian.
Yeah, you can't.
Which Robert
Also,
Jordan
yeah,
wrote.
there we go. You can't just, like, walk into a Barnes & Noble and have this huge... So, yeah, Wheel of Time was really feeding a need. There was fantasy, of course, happening in the 70s and 80s and all of that, but not to the best of my knowledge, mass extent.
Well, I think that was a time also when, like, fandom at large was becoming more and more prevalent. That was when you had Star Wars coming out. The 80s are famously when a lot of things came out that people became attached to in terms of, like, brands and stories and worlds specifically.
Excuse me. Yep.
So the stage was kind of set. That doesn't, like, negate the fact that Wheel of Time was a commercial success, but it is important to point out that, like, Robert Jordan had an easier time reaching commercial success than, Joe Schmo on the street would.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr., indie booksellers. And then there's other sort of external factors of success. One of those, these days especially, is whether it gets picked up for adaptation. It seems like no book series can be left in peace.
Yeah.
No brand, no property can be left without being rebooted or adapted or any other thing.
Yeah.
So Wheel of the Time.
Wheel of the Time.
So Wheel of Time was picked up after, I think, a very long and strenuous thing. It has 2 seasons out. I believe a third one is supposed to come out.
Yeah.
But the sort of logistics of TV making these days make those things impossible to predict.
Yeah.
And I think the Wheel of Time TV series has been fairly successful.
Yeah, I think so.
I do think that it's important to note that the Wheel of Time TV series has been successful because a lot of what made Wheel of Time marketable in the 90s would make it absolutely unsellable these days. Particularly its gender politics, and the fact that it's mostly white people.
Yeah.
Of course, you can sell that to a niche group of people, but the public at large prefers their stories a little more diverse these days and a little less egregiously men are from Mars, women are from Venus. So in its way, the Wheel of Time TV adaptation has had to, like, change the very fabric of the story in order to make something marketable.
Yeah.
Now the women are to veer in because that's not just something boys get to do. We have more girl power, we have queer people, we have people of color in main roles. La-di-da-di-da.
Yeah, I would say that the Wheel of Time adaptation's been successful. Obviously, most fans seem to really like it, and it's also seemed to gain popularity outside of the fandom itself. Like, I have family members who've never read Wheel of Time who are like, I liked that. I thought it was good. I enjoyed it as a fantasy show. Which, of course, another reason these types of adaptations, of course, are successful is the Game of Thrones TV show. We've talked about that extensively. A lot of stuff I hate to say riding the coattails, because it's good that more fantasy media is being made, but that definitely plays a role.
Yeah, we're definitely having this pattern of Wheel of Time stepping in to fill a gap.
Yeah.
Which makes it marketable. And the adaptation at large is sort of shaping Wheel of Time's legacy in a more positive light than it might otherwise have had. Just because those things are being changed for the adaptation, it's allowing a lot of people to forget or to dismiss or sideline the more uncomfortable parts of the Wheel of Time series, which, you know, just means that its legacy is going to be a little bit whitewashed, which isn't necessarily, like, I don't want to cast any sort of moral judgment on that. I think that just happens to media. An author, any sort of artist or creator releases their work into the world and really can't predict what sort of legacy it will have, or how it will be received decades down the line, how other people will come in and get their hands on it, you know?
Sure.
We have seen that so many countless times with, like, Harry Potter being a major commercial success when it was being released, and now the entire property has been entirely tarnished by J.K. Rowling being a TERF and a horrible person.
Yeah.
Nabokov probably didn't intend Lolita to have the sort of slice of the market that it did have.
Yeah.
That it does have.
Yeah, I wonder how Nabokov would feel about the fact that there's an entire, like, subculture of Lolita girls that, like, dress that way. Sorry, it's just a funny concept to you sit Nabokov down in front of Instagram.
And he's like, what?
No, that wasn't the point at all.
You guys know it was bad, right? It was about a bad person.
It was bad.
It was about doing morally reprehensible things.
That's what it was about. And everyone's like, no.
Yeah, and people either take that in one extremely puritanical way, or they take it in the most, like, liberated sense possible. Yeah. And neither of those is necessarily good or bad, that's just what it is.
Sure, and I agree that it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing that Amazon and the showmakers have attempted to correct some of the errors of Robert Jordan's.
Yeah, like the alternative is they cast an all-white cast and kept sort of the rape jokes throughout, blah, 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 and obviously no one wants that. Yeah,
which is, it's very bad. But I also think it's just, which is unfortunately something our society is not maintaining our skill set for, is like we need to hold space for both. Like we need to hold space for what the original text actually is, and we need to be able to confront that, which I hope is one small legacy of our podcast, that if you have loved Wheel of Time for a long time or read it for the first time, you can use this as a place to sort of confront and hold up a mirror to some of the stuff that is really unpleasant and unsettling about it. But we can also have the adaptation that takes, a really fun story concept and makes it less racist and bad.
For now.
For now, you're right. We have not gotten the Empire herself. So...
And then, of course, there's, like, Wheel of Time, like, along with its legacy, it's like, okay, we referenced it earlier in, like, regards to Lord of the Rings and sort of Game of Thrones as well, but, like, these things have, like, staying power because of how they changed the game. Ironically enough, I think Game of Thrones will have more staying power because it was adapted.
Yeah.
Than it would have as an unfinished book series.
George. Sit down at that computer.
You can do it, George. We're all rooting for you.
I guess. At this point, I'm like, whatever. It's just never going to be finished.
Yeah, I don't know which I think is funnier in the end. If he just beefs it and then Brandon Sanders.
Could you imagine poor Brandon sits down
and is like, ugh.
Yeah. What were we talking about? The staying power of these massive fantasy texts.
Yeah, and, like, how does Wheel of Time compare to any of that?
Yeah.
And I think we've mostly kind of said, like, well, it's stepped in to fill a gap, largely. And, of course, you can't, in hindsight or retrospect, really make a decision as to whether an entire series, if it didn't exist, how the world would be changed. That's a sort of Twilight Zone project that we can't necessarily... engage in. And I think Wheel of Time had, like, Like, what I'm trying to say is there's Lord of the Rings, you know, and Lord of the Rings is always going to be the thing.
Yeah, totally.
And we are all willing to accept that and move on. And then there are authors who take Lord of the Rings, or at least take the world in which Lord of the Rings is the thing, and are like, okay, here's what I'm doing in response to that, or to change it, or to upend it entirely. Here's how I am improving upon the genre. You get your Ursula K. Gwynns of the world, who are like, I'm taking the hero's journey and doing interesting things with it in the same vein that Jert was doing it, or in more like feminist and various lines of thought. You get George R.R. Martin, who takes Lord of the Rings and is like, I don't want this, I don't want the like idealism of this, or the sort of lack of detail-oriented world building that I perceive in Lord of the Rings. So I'm going to make things grim and dark and more reflective of actual medieval times.
Yeah.
And then you have Wheel of Time, which seems to be, what if we did The Hero's Journey, Lord of the Rings, etc. And I guess the project was, in some ways, to be like, well, what if I threw some Eastern philosophy into there? What if the sort of notion of light versus dark, good versus evil, was complicated by the idea of duality and balance in all things? So, okay. Which brings us, I guess, to sort of like Wheel of Time's themes and whether or not they were successful on an internal scale. Like, did Robert Jordan successfully say something?
Yeah, I just want to make one quick sidebar. We're referencing, as we talk about sort of like genre hallmarkers, a lot of white people, which is unfortunately been the case in fantasy for a long time. It's definitely been a genre, much like all of publishing, really dominated by white people. There are many fantastic authors of color who are taking the genre and doing much more interesting things than Wheel of Time. So I think that's just one thing to keep in mind. I don't really have a concrete thought. I just think it would be we'd be amiss not to point out that that's kind of the canon that Robert Jordan is working in, or the vein that he's working in, was very much this sort of like white brand of fantasy. And in terms of pushing the genre forward, there's a lot of people of color, queer people, etc., who are really taking the genre of fantasy that was posited by these big texts like Lord of the Rings and to some extent Wheel of Time, and doing much more interesting things to shake up that genre.
Yeah, I think a hallmark of success within a genre is whether it builds upon the path and like leaves it open to more exploration and more things.
Love it.
And I think the thing about Wheel of Time is that it's ultimately a dead end. As opposed to, say, works by like N.K. Jemisin, who's doing a lot in the epic fantasy genre, who we've read her work over on We Don't Watch Outlander, I think at least once. And like, I personally haven't read an N.K. Jemisin book that I really like, but I recognize that N.K. Jemisin is building more into the path and opening the genre itself into more exploration about other cultures besides Western European culture, making it available for people who aren't white. Yeah. Which is huge. And ultimately just like looking at things from a different perspective than a white man's. Yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of the fact that Wheel of Time is a dead end is that it was a white guy, written by a white guy, who didn't actually have much to add.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that brings us sort of perfectly back to what you were saying of like the idea of introducing an Eastern philosophy into this sort of Western hallmark of good versus evil is super interesting. As we talked about extensively at the end of the Wheel of Time, Brandon and or Robert really fumbled that theme. Like, it is effectively incomprehensible what is going on at the end between Rand and the Dark One. Like, it's, to me as a first-time reader, was really illegible the more I think about what we were trying to get out between Rand and the Dark One. Like, yes, I understand the Dark One is a, quote, necessary evil, but, like, that theme just did not resonate for me at all. But
yeah, trying to blend Western sort of monotheistic philosophies with Eastern philosophies regarding duality and balance. Yeah. Is sort of, like, interesting and maybe doable if you were only going to write 3 books about that.
Yeah.
And could sort of, like, keep it tight.
Yeah, if that was kind of one of the only things you were trying to explore, or potentially if you were someone with much more background in Eastern religion and
Yeah.
philosophy. I don't know the extent of Robert Jordan's sort of
Scholarship,
yeah.
but he was a Western guy.
Yeah, and it's just like, I know that I probably will never have as much context as someone who's grown up in it and studied it, or is a practicing Buddhist or anything like that, and that is okay. Doesn't mean I can't write about it. It is just a limitation that I have.
Yeah, it's ironic because I think a lot of what the Wheel of Time as a series is trying to do regarding its themes is made undoable by the sheer length of the series.
Yeah, snaps for that.
Like, a lot of the things you're trying to say about fate and free will and everything else gets really bogged down once you start veering off of that path into a different theme entirely, which is this sort of, like, realism that George R.R. Martin is also big on in terms of the politics of everything that's going on, all this, like, multiculturalism and the actual mechanics of preparing the world for the last battle. Robert Jordan simply could not be concise about that, which I understand if you're writing book to book, you keep being like, well, we're just not there yet.
Yeah.
That's how it keeps feeling. At the end of every book after book 3, you're not like, well, everyone's ready to fight the last battle, you know?
Let's go. Yeah, it's constantly like, oh, we have yet another rung on the ladder to climb.
Yeah, or we have just too many problems, too many Forsaken running around in order to be prepared for this.
Yeah. Our question here is around themes. Sorry, I got distracted. We're talking about themes and whether it posited any of that successfully. One thing this feels really relevant to my experience of the Wheel of Time. I have never read an epic fantasy series, with the exception of Lord of the Rings, and even there I'll put kind of a big asterisk on it, that needs to be as long as it is. I've never read one except Lord of the Rings, which I'm looking at our condensed copy that has Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return of the King in it, and I'm like, that is like the size of one Wheel of Time book, all 3 of those, even though that's still a pretty long series, you know, like it's more manageable. So something like Mistborn or The Wheel of Time or Game of Thrones, that to me has justified the length of the series. Like, I've never read one where the page length felt necessary. So I think this is maybe just like a hurdle that I'm really having of being like, why was the series as long as it was? I see what you're saying about like the realism, and that was Robert Jordan's project. I don't mean to completely dunk on that if you found that interesting, but as a reader, talking about it as like a literary text, successful or not in terms of what it said, the length feels unjustifiable to me.
I think the length of Wheel of Time is definitely unjustifiable. I think the sort of epic fantasy genre as a whole relies on the fact that it puts out these huge books, and that's what separates it from more normal fantasy and fiction. And that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but I do think there is a subset of people who want to read a really long book and who get some, like, joy that you and I don't necessarily personally get out of just the details of world building and sort of living in a fantasy world, even if not a lot is happening within the fantasy world. I think the hallmark of, like, a good epic fantasy series that is good within the genre and not just because it is long is really just whether it's able to, like, say something within its themes. Because at least you can say of Lord of the Rings, sure, we know very well with Lord of the Rings that there is shit you can cut.
Yeah.
Peter Jackson went in and proved that.
Sliced and diced it, baby.
Tom Bombadil, don't need him.
Rip.
Rip that guy. He does add something, but he's not
very additive.
Needed.
Yeah.
So there's always stuff you can cut. But everything that Lord of the Rings does within the text is gesturing towards something cohesive and coherent. And Wheel of Time is not.
Sure. You make a good point. I might be struggling with it specifically with Wheel of Time. And again, I really don't mean to dunk on it. If you guys are like an epic, you love it, you love reading all these long books, I love that for you. To me, you're so right. It is more of an experience of reading it versus what the text is actually doing. And that's what it makes it successful for people who enjoy that. I'm obviously not of that ilk, so I will try to shift my mindset here. But yeah, with Wheel of Time, you make a really valid point. Like, it does not justify its page length. because fundamentally very little has been said in the like 12,000 pages or whatever that has been written.
I do think there is something interesting in the idea that maybe there is like a threshold at which length becomes just incoherent.
Yeah.
And Wheel of Time definitely hit it.
Around the one we skipped, I feel, is the one where I think it was
the threshold.
Very telling, yeah.
And it's hard because I'm trying to go over like the other epic fantasy series that I've read, and none of them is as long as Wheel of Time.
Yeah, I was trying to think
up.
earlier, like, what is maybe some of the like Discworld stuff that Terry Pratchett wrote, but I've never read those. And
they're all standalone novellas.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're right. They're not interconnected in the same way.
The closest I can come is Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings series, which she's put out like, oh god, this isn't it's not the same as Wheel of Time where it's just a story in 14 books, 1 to 14 in order. She has 9 books that are 1 to 9 in order, but there are stopping points after each trilogy where it's very much like, okay, I can leave this and never think about it again, and that's fine. And then there's like a companion series that is additive, and they go back on each other and da-da-da-da-da. Even though, having read those 9 books, I found myself with that series at about book like 7, 8, being like, I feel like we are going over things that I have already learned.
Yeah.
And covering ground that has already been covered, and I feel like characters are making negative progress.
Yeah.
Blah, 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 blah. I guess the other like super long series that's coming out on a contemporary level is Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives. Unfortunately, we can't really speak to that. I've read the first 2 books, I think, but have not ventured back into it. Sally hasn't read it. We both know people who are. But it's hard to get a Brandon Sanderson fan, no offense.
Yeah.
to sort of step back enough and gauge whether the series as a whole is doing something coherently, or if it's just a fun fantasy series that they enjoy because they enjoy Brandon Sanderson's style.
Yeah, which is so valid. It's also hard with that one because it's not finished, and apparently isn't going to be finished for
Brandon Sanderson keeps
forever.
Being like, I'm going to stop for 10 years. And then 3 years later, he's like, just kidding.
I wrote this book because I write 12 hours a day because I'm built very different than the rest of humanity.
Yeah.
Which, like, honestly, good for him if that's what he can do. If I stare at a computer screen for 30 minutes, I want to gouge my eyeballs out Oedipus style. So,
For real.
Maybe he's just sort of psycho projecting it into the computer from his mind palace.
Yeah, he doesn't even have to type. He's
Yeah.
just laser eyes into the computer.
If anyone would do it, Brandon Sanderson would figure out how. I'm obviously much less of an epic fantasy reader because I don't enjoy that particular slog. And I don't want to call it a slog. That's negative. I don't enjoy that pace. It's not satisfying for me. And that is okay. But yeah, you do have to wonder about this question that you're positing of like, is there a threshold? And I guess that depends on the reader very much. Like there are people I know who love Wheel of Time and could reread it right now and not think anything of it and like blast through a 700-page book in like 3 days. And that's slay. You have an amazing brain. For me personally, as the person who is running this podcast, very much there is a threshold. Very much there is a threshold. And again, I think for me around book 7 is when it really started to get really hard for me. And I think there's a reason that's kind of known as like the slog period in this series of like Robert. We've kind of, I think even though people aren't articulating it this way, I think everyone in the fandom kind of agrees that like a threshold was hit where something needed to change perhaps, and then it just like didn't for the next kind of 4 books.
Yeah, Robert Jordan, I think, was pretty cohesive and coherent and also maintaining a reasonable enough pace from books 1 through 6.5.
Yeah.
And then just hit a period of like stasis, and regarding the characters and the themes, all the characters stalled out.
Yeah.
And all of the themes stalled out. Which made it very weird when we came back in books 12 through 14, and Brandon Sanderson is suddenly like, hey, just a reminder, here are themes again. You're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
I thought this was just about whether, Elaine could keep the throne of Andor. I forgot that this series is also about, like, fate and free will. That hasn't been really interesting part of the series in a while.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that maybe it's possible to write 14 books about the same thing and, really stick the landing on it, but Robert Jordan didn't do it.
Yeah, I agree. So, EHR final draw, we do not feel as though the themes were successful, but here are some of the themes that Robert Jordan has presented to us. Fate and free will, as Emily has talked about. That's kind of introduced first chapter and then brought back around in the end about, is the universe pulling people in specific directions, or do the choices that people make ultimately really matter?
That's something that is introduced, I think, to great effect early in the series when we have doing experiments with like alternate realities and sort of this butterfly effect notion. We also have our three main boys are Taviran, which means that literally the pattern warps itself around them, but it becomes less and less clear whether they change the pattern or the pattern moves them.
Yep.
And it seems to be some mixture of the two. Then you have this fate of duality and balance, the idea that there are two sides to every coin. That's very obvious in Wheel of Time's imagery with the yin-yang symbol, blah, 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 light, dark,
Yeah.
etc. And unfortunately, Wheel of Time takes the, gender divide, which isn't uncommon in theologies and philosophies regarding duality. That is always how people have divided it. And how presumably people are going to continue to divide it until the blessed day in the distant future, I imagine, when gender becomes less relevant.
Yeah. One day.
But so this sort of duality of yin-yang, light and dark, has this thing with, both good and evil, which is its own thing, and then the other main thing Robert Jordan was doing was men and women. So then it becomes both a gender exploration and a good versus evil exploration side by side. And one of those things is moral, and one of those things is not.
Yeah.
And it becomes a little muddied in the waters between them.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because, as you reference, we'll take Christian theology for an example. Good and evil have been mapped onto symbolically and archetypically men and women. Eve, of course, ate the apple. Eve is the source of original sin or what have you. And so therefore women are accursed and evil and have, a natural tendency towards chaos, etc., etc. Robert Jordan has taken that mythology of, quote, breaking the world and flipped it onto men. So we have Lutheran and his 99 companions, or however many he has.
The 100 companions.
100 companions. Sorry to the guy I left out.
Billy,
no. Who break the world by, sealing the Dark One's prison incorrectly or whatever they did. And that, I think, is one of the reasons people are interested in this as a feminist text, being like, oh, what, they're taking this really fundamental part of Western thought and flipping it on its head. But we've talked about this as well. It's impossible to present a story where in our current understanding of patriarchy and matriarchy to totally flip that without just reversing really problematic power dynamics. And that's all that Robert Jordan did, and then he didn't even do that successfully because it's not as though women in the series actually hold any clear power.
Yeah, a really successful aspect of world building and of fantasy and sci-fi generally is sort of famously can you change one thing?
Yeah.
And then see how that butterfly effect impacts the rest of the world. You can take one single concept and then be like, well, what if? I just watched a really good series about this on Apple TV recently with Severance, the idea being, what if you could split your brain into two different selves, one who goes to work and does work and one who exists outside of the work. And Severance is a really good sci-fi show because it gets into the ethics of that as well as into the minutia of that. And doing that requires a level of imagination that I fear Robert Jordan just did not have.
Yeah.
He has some really imaginative set pieces, and the very concept itself is imaginative, but you really have to, dig down in there into, what does that mean for everyone? And I think what Robert Jordan did was say, okay, I'm going to flip it but then he couldn't ever really escape the sort of patriarchy from within.
Yeah. Yeah. They're two wolves
The
inside.
call was coming
Yeah.
from inside the house.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it's such a good point that, like, if you're changing, world building has to be, surprise, consistent throughout the entire world. So if you're choosing this idea that you're introducing in books sort of 1, 2, 3-ish, that men might be a, quote, sort of secondary class, specifically where Aes Sedai are involved, you can't then just, like, negate that with the other 9 books of the series where that's effectively irrelevant and every Aes Sedai is just a raging bitch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and books that try and do that successful, like, who try and just reverse the gender dynamic, like you said, just end up being like, well, the world is still bad and awful.
Yeah, and it's like people seem to forget that, like, the fundamental problem of patriarchy is not men, it is the domination aspect of it. You find the same systems of power and patriarchy as you find under white supremacy and heteronormativity, this idea that there is one thing that is correct and better. So you can't just take that and flip that onto women and have it be somehow empowered. Mm-hmm. So
it's going to be anti-feminist.
It's going to be anti-feminist fundamentally as a sort of ideology. Yeah, it's something people seem to forget, is that the underlying problem of these systems of power is the power and domination aspect of it. It is not who is holding the power, it is the unequal distribution of it, you know. Anyway, we've talked about gender enough.
And we won't ever have to again, thank God.
Gender is over, officially.
Gender's over.
We're ending it right now.
I'm planting my flag. It's done.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hear about it anymore.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing I think Wheel of Time set out to do, and maybe met more success with than some of these other themes, was sort of this exploration of being the chosen one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which Rand does to, despite the fact that we hate him, which I think Rand does an interesting job of exploring, except in that, you know, mid-book slog in which everyone's character development stalls.
Yeah.
Rand would be a much more bearable character if that, like, 5-book slog was just condensed into one book, and we had his sort of overarching despair and list of dead women wasn't going on forever and ever.
Oh my god, the list of dead women.
Interestingly, I read this on one of the wikis that Robert Jordan's initial idea was to have, like, a chosen one who becomes a chosen one later in life. You know, sort of an older, middle-aged man.
Yeah.
Which I think he probably couldn't let die quite with Lan. But the anecdote goes that as soon as he sort of let that go and was like, I will just do a really one-to-one Lord of the Rings type thing, he was able to find more, like, steam regarding the writing. But I do think there's still some, like, conceptual stuff there in terms of just a really, like, intense psychological dive into the type of pressure you would have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that you would suffer being a chosen one.
Yeah, agreed. I think this is one thing that Wheel of Time does more successful than many series. In part, this is one instance where, though it's too long, the length of the series does it some credit. Like, we're able to follow Rand's psyche with this through sort of, like, ebbs and flows and trials and errors. Like, not a lot of series give us the exploration, as troubling as it is, of, like, what if the chosen one ultimately decided that they have, carte blanche to use whatever firepower they want, and balefire is just, like, Rand's thing for a really long time. So it gives us the ability to explore these different facets of what it means to be the chosen one. Sometimes that leads to Rand's character feeling a little fractured, but overall I think it is quite cohesive, this sort of arc of, like, how do I deal with this, to this is really upsetting, to I'm going to a really dark place, to I'm reaching enlightenment. All of that feels like a really natural and interesting progression of what that type of psychological pressure would do to a person.
Yeah, regardless of how it is as a reading experience, like, when you take a step back, you're like, okay, Rand's sort of character progression and regression in some cases makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not pleasant, the list of dead women, and in an opposite direction, enlightened Rand isn't pleasant either.
No, he's a freak.
He's a weird, cringy freak.
Yeah.
You know? But the whole thing, taken as a whole, is interesting.
Yeah. Are there any themes on your list that we didn't talk about? I feel like there have to more books this long have more
Of
themes.
Yeah, of course there are more themes, but we don't need to talk about all of them. The only
Yeah.
other things I had on my list in terms of like internal success was the world building, which we've talked about as being pretty inconsistent.
Yeah. Yeah. The more we talk about it, the more I do think Wheel of Time holds an interesting spot in the genre, from going from this sort of like idealism of Tolkien and like the mythic foundations of fantasy into the realism that we're seeing with a lot of stuff these days, of this sort of like weird middle ground that I think it was straddling, of being very pastoral and very like the period in time that it's trying to hold of like a bit of an industrial revolution is happening is interesting in terms of concept.
Yeah, along with that is sort of another theme, I guess, that we didn't touch on, which was like Robert Jordan's obsession with multiculturalism.
Yeah.
Sort of that both as a realistic component of any sort of fantasy world, that there are going to be lots and lots of different groups of people with lots and lots of different values, ethics, ways of engaging with the world, and sort of his theme, his ideological theme, which was, and everyone just needs to be able to come together in order to defeat the ultimate evil. Unfortunately, I think those two things, realism and idealism, clash, especially in the later series, so that's another theme that I don't think was successful.
Yeah.
Especially because in the same way that Robert Jordan approached writing gender, he approached culture and multiculturalism from the standpoint of a very narrow mind.
Yeah.
And I understand that he was probably considered to be very broad-minded in his day, but we're in 2024.
Yeah, it's this sort of like pitfall that I think a lot of white fantasy writers in particular fall into, where it's just kind of like, I will cherry pick pieces of culture that feel, quote, exotic to me, and therefore it will make the culture feel different without, and I don't know, I wasn't in Robert Jordan's head while this is happening. I've just seen this happen in other series. Where it's like, oh, I'll pick something like women wearing veils in Tanchico or wherever they wear them and be like, oh, that suddenly makes it feel like a very different culture. Whereas like, that doesn't actually like really mean anything. You didn't like put any values into Terabon that mean anything about why they would wear veils or why they wouldn't wear veils. Like, it's not coherent enough. You've just grabbed something that you've seen in the Middle East and other cultures and have slapped it on as sort of like, you know, whitewash on something. That was not the word I'm looking for, but just like a thin veneer of multiculturalism.
Yeah, we're taking the aesthetic poles of multiculturalism without diving into really the sort of complications of them. And then when he did try to dive into complications of them regarding like the Shanshin and the Ale, two cultures that are much more fleshed out in terms of not just having aesthetic differences, but having real cultural differences, you also end up in this weird place where with the Ale you still somehow manage to make it feel fetishizing, even though it's a fantasy culture. And with the Shanshin you manage to make it feel like, I mean, we've talked so much about the failures of the Shanshin as a culture, but I think the dangers of bringing realism into a fantasy text, and Robert Jordan was so clearly trying to do you know, like draw from real world history and real world cultures to varying degrees of success. But then the problem when you do that and when it's very transparent is that you end up sort of making statements that you aren't necessarily intending to make. I think, ironically, and I'm sorry to keep bringing up other works, especially the same handful of works, but ironically, I think this is something that Game of Thrones actually managed to pull off, was the, and you know, the series isn't finished, but we have the show. But the idea that varying groups of people have to come together to fight off a much larger and more existential threat. And I think it's successful, more successful in Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones obviously has its problems because no one is positioned as good or bad in Game of Thrones. You do have sort of like the good Starks, but the Starks become way more morally ambiguous as the series goes on, matching every other group of people. Everyone's doing incest, everyone's doing rape, everyone's doing slavery and bad shit. So them coming together doesn't feel like, oh, well, we're all just compromising on the value of human life in order to save ourselves. It feels a lot more like, oh yeah, people can come together.
Even bad people can have a productive co-working session.
Yeah.
One thing, a phrase I was reminded of when we're reading Lord of the Rings is least knowledgeable character. So this can be really effective in fantasy settings, particularly like a portal quest. Like in order to explain the world around you, your point of view sits with your least knowledgeable character. So that they can ask questions and not understand what's going on, and then you as the reader get the information alongside of them. But the really unfortunate side effect of this, especially if you're really playing with multiculturalism, is that everything then gets this fetishizing, if you're not really careful with it, this fetishizing and exoticizing effect of like, wow, they eat this crazy food and like stuff like that. And Robert Jordan, of course, has many points of view character in the Ale and the Shan-Chen, but like we're not first introduced to these cultures from within. I think we've made this argument before. We're very much introduced to them from without. And in the Ale's case, that is really detrimental. And in the Shan-Chen's case, it's just really confusing because it's like the readers are like, well, the characters are like, well, they do good things, you know, despite the horrors, but we're still not given that inside perspective first off. So it just feels weird, but
yeah, another L in the books.
L in Robert Jordan's thing. But I think this maybe will lead us into talking about point of view characters, might lead us to our next big section that we wanted to check in on. This is probably going to be a long episode.
Yeah. I think the only other thing to talk about really in terms of the internal success of the book is whether your characters are successful, whether they have successful arcs, whether or not they are, really that's it, actually, whether or not they have any character can be successful if they have a point A to point B journey.
Yeah, so let's go through our main characters. Emily informed me Elaine has more points of view than Nynaeve.
Yes, I found a website documenting points of view. And somehow Elaine has more than Nynaeve, which I think goes to show you that there was some favoritism from within.
Yeah. So why don't we just start with Elaine because she's here. And my personal least favorite character that we will be talking about. Elaine starts as the princess of Andor and becomes the queen of Andor. So I guess that is an arc.
That is an arc. That is a point A to point B. Nothing was said.
Yes.
In that. Nothing was done to sort of disengage Elaine from any of the systems of power, or any of the problems that she had as a character back at point A. Elaine starts the series privileged, largely naive regarding the world, largely convinced in this sort of like idealism of the monarchy and of her own position within it, and she ends in the same place.
Yeah.
Nothing is done to disprove that. Elaine does have to go through trials and tribulations, but ultimately does not change much as a character.
Yeah, and all the trials and tribulations are almost like rites of passage for her more than anything else. Like, can she win the throne the same way her mom did? Can she secure an heir? All of these things that are like just what people do when they're in monarchies.
We have Edwina, on the other hand, who's making a much less lateral move.
Yeah.
But in terms of like upward class mobility, is starting from farm girl, well, really she's an innkeeper's daughter, to becoming the Amerlin seat. And we have with Edwina a lot of unfulfilled ambition at the very beginning of the series, an interest in being her own person and disengaging from Rand as sort of a love interest. We don't get very many Egg points of view early on, but we see that Egg wants to be her own person. I want to see the world out there.
Yeah.
And Edwina manages to accomplish all of those things. Edwina also manages to, it's not just like about Edwina asserting herself or about like changing enough of her personality to become what she needs to be, although I think that is part of her character arc. I think it's about like kind of taking the really good aspects of her as a character and moving them into the correct position.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Edwina starts out very ambitious, very curious and hardworking and all of these things, very smart, but she's ultimately, you know, like unsettled and doesn't really know how all of these pieces fit together. It is unfortunate that she has to go through so much like physical torment in order to get from there to the very self-assured, tactical, clever, powerful Amerlin we have at the end. But yeah, it is about aligning her in all of the right ways, not just in terms of her position in the world, but her internal ordering of herself. So I say out of all of them, Egg might have the most successful character arc. Like, her arc is really beautifully done.
Yeah, ironically, Egg does die, which we have our own, like, beef with,
Yeah.
but I think that is actually doing something interesting for her character arc in that, unlike Rand, she actually dies.
Yeah.
Which means that, unlike Rand, Edwene is actually fulfilling this traditional heroic role of self-sacrifice.
Yep.
Which is, in its way, very beautiful.
Yeah.
That she's given the agency to do that and will be remembered in such a way.
Yes.
Sticking with the female characters, we have Nynaeve, who I fear, like Elaine, does not do much in terms of movement.
Yeah.
Well, you have something interesting with Nynaeve in that she is, like Edwene, moving through the trappings of upward social mobility. Mm-hmm. She's going from town wisdom, town midwife healer, to becoming more or less one of the most powerful Aes Sedai on the planet. Yeah. She has tons of respect and acclaim. She's doing this, like, incredibly important thing, everything throughout. She helped cleanse Sidon, you know?
That was badass of her.
She's doing all this badass stuff. She's personally taken out a bunch of the Forsaken.
Yeah. She's got a hit list.
So she's doing that like Edwene, but like Elaine, I think, in terms of like actual character growth, she is not growing much.
Agreed.
And with Elaine and Nynaeve both, I fear, the narrative has substituted actual character growth with romance.
Yep.
Sort of the idea that, like, a woman will just become more of herself and become an even better person if she has a man that she's tying down.
Yeah, how much more can we talk about the fact that Nynaeve's big cure for all of her problems is getting married?
Mm-hmm. Like, you do some interesting things with Nynaeve initially with her block regarding channeling and sort of, like, this idea of claiming her own power and leaning into it and not being afraid of herself in the same way that she is early in the series. But I think it really stalls out in the later half of the series after she gets married to Lan. Mm-hmm. It's like they just didn't know what to do with her after she was married.
Well, that's what happens to women. They're not important once they're married.
Yeah, that's true.
Her next thing she's got to do is have a baby, and then we can just kill her.
Over with Perrin.
Mr. Character Development himself.
Mr. Character Development. He starts as a cautious, ultimately, I think, very fearful character, who learns to embrace the parts of him that he is afraid of. And he does that for 14 books.
Repeatedly. Almost every chapter.
Repeatedly. So there's a way... There's the Elaine and Nynaeve school of thought where it's not enough character development. And then there's the Perrin school of thought where it's way too much character development.
Way too much.
Overdeveloped.
You
took this very simple concept and then developed the shit out of it.
And you really threw a lot of hammers into those metaphors.
Oh, God. And then there's Matt.
And then there's our boy.
Who is doing...
Matt is Mr. Character Development in a different way, where, like, so much interesting stuff is actually happening with Matt's character. Like, his character is constantly... It's very constant. It's very consistent. Like, the sort of core of Matt throughout the series is very consistent, reliable, lovely, silly, wants to, reject all these trappings of responsibility, but is ultimately, super reliable and silly, our slippery trickster god. But then you're just putting him in situations constantly.
Yeah. Matt, it feels like the most things happen to Matt.
Yeah.
Which feels insane.
Yeah.
Considering we also have a series where things are happening to Rand.
Yeah.
But it's like things are happening to Matt constantly. And it's always the most insane shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt, I think, is an interesting character because, like, he gets a point of view. He doesn't get a point of view until book 3. Mm-hmm. Which means I believe that Elaine has had a point of view before him.
Oh, yeah, wow. That's weird.
So he is the last to get a point of view, and is also the most consistent with character development up until the dark days of Brandon Sanderson, R.I.P. About another pretty simple in the Perrin style thing, which is like, how do you take a boy who does not want responsibility, and sort of force him to acknowledge responsibility.
Yeah, like how do you take that person and you make him truly the only person in the world capable of doing a task, and how do you get him to and this is, again, like we've talked about, one reason where Matt's character fumbles at the fault line, because it's not that he's the most capable of doing it, it's that he's unbrainwashable because of his magic medallion, and that's really unfortunate. But he did get the medallion after all of his trials, so I guess there's something there.
No, I agree. Instead of leaning into his character development, it's leaning into a clever trick. Which in its way is very Matt-like, but we're not Matt. We are the readers of the book series. Yeah, Matt's character fumbles at the end, both with Brandon Sanderson and sort of the, like, two-on hold thing. Obviously, the idea there was, okay, responsibility and, like, monogamy, matrimony in this world are also, like, something, are inextricably tied. And so part of Matt taking responsibility is sort of allowing himself to be quote-unquote tied down. But then you just get into all these murky waters of Robert Jordan's gender politics and sort of fascism apologia.
Yeah.
And it gets really tough. So Matt definitely best character arc up until 7, I'd say.
Agreed.
And then somehow it's Rand.
Who
we've talked about already as actually having a pretty cohesive, coherent...
Yeah, in terms of, like, what is actually happening to him psychologically, solid.
Yeah, Rand, I think, is interesting for having a lot of internal action as well as a lot of external action. Which you get things like Perrin and Elaine have a lot of internal things. They're thinking a lot, but they're not actually doing a lot.
Yeah.
And then you have people like Matt and Edwene who are doing everything all the time, constantly.
Yeah.
And whether or not the character development can keep up with them is its own question.
Yeah.
And Rand manages to balance those things pretty neatly.
Yeah.
So yeah, ironically enough, despite this podcast being titled Everybody Hates Rand, we must acknowledge that Rand is one of the finer characters in this series.
Yeah, from a character build. As a person, despicable.
Wouldn't want to meet him at all.
At every stage in his character development, I find him despicable for a different way. Just all forms of despicable, like a 20-sided dice.
But
structurally, super solid.
Yeah.
Super solid. Both in terms of, like, the psychological stuff, like we've talked about, his archetypes as a chosen one, as a Jesus figure, as a Buddha figure. All of these things are done really, really well. Which you'd hope they would be. He is our main character, so at least they did it. At least they did him good.
Yeah, I think the conclusion is that Wheel of Time is, like every book series, a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Whether or not there's more negative than positive is, I think for us, tends a little bit more towards the negative. But there's also a huge chunk of that, like we've acknowledged, that's just like, if you're built to enjoy epic fantasy in a way that we aren't,
yeah,
then maybe it's going to be a more enjoyable and enriching experience for you.
Yeah, and yeah, like in terms of just like sheer enjoyment value, there are people who are built fundamentally to enjoy Wheel of Time as a project much more than I am. I also think to kind of one thing I think is maybe valuable to end on here, or guide us into our final stretch of, like, I know we want to stay away from successful as like a good or a bad thing, and I think I'm trying to figure out exactly how to say this, but it's like, I think there is place in the world for texts like Wheel of Time that try a lot of stuff and fail a lot of stuff, both as like in storytelling, but also in these multiculturalism things that we're talking about. In terms of the fascism apologia, good phrase, like, yes, that is bad and that is a dangerous thing for people to think about, but I'm hoping that it gets people thinking about it. And if the Shanshan make you uncomfortable in any way, like you are thinking about it, it is a way for us to sort of hold up a lens to the way that fascism gets put up as like a solution when things are bad enough. We're watching Arcane right now, so this feels appropriate. Like, let's just give it to one person and they'll figure out what they can do with it. That feels simpler. So it does give us a way to hold mirrors up to problems. That's not the main purpose of a book. It doesn't have to. I know I tend in my analysis really towards that direction of like, what does this say about our world? How does this prompt us to think about different things? That's very much where my literary training went with the type of research I did in college, but that's not the only valuable analysis. Is it successful as a text internally, like we've talked about? But in terms of, has it been worth it for us to talk about it for 7 years? I think in some ways, yeah. Like, I feel like I've learned, not in some ways, in many ways, I've learned a lot. It was a good text. It's always a good project, I think, to sit down and close read anything. I think close reading as a thought process more than anything is really valuable. Really teaches you a lot about many things. So that was not really coherent, but that's what I've got.
No, yeah, I agree completely. There's a lot to be said from a moralizing frame regarding Wheel of Time, just as there is to be said about any text. But ultimately, that's not what we want you to leave with.
Yeah.
We want you to leave here with more thoughts than you came with.
Yeah.
However that came to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've been judgmental, I think, because the being an English major, which neither of us has been for many years now, but we were recently when we started this podcast. You're required to write a lot of essays, make a lot of judgment calls, have a lot of opinions that, ironically, considering the sort of grayscale of literature itself, want you to be sort of black or white. In your thinking. And so, although we've made judgments, I don't want our legacy to be that we were super judgmental, more that we just left you with some possibilities in your thought.
Yeah, and all of this is not to say that there are not significant problems with the Wheel of Time, as Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson wrote it. I think we all can agree on that, or at least you can agree that that is what EHR thinks. But it is not ultimately, I think, always the best use of our time, the best use of like our analytical power to be like good or bad and slot things into these categories of like, this was a good book or this was a bad book. Maybe this is really heavy on the mind as like book bans become more and more of a thing. I think, sure, it's easy enough to be like, yeah, Wheel of Time was bad, so you shouldn't read it. But that just becomes a really slippery slope to like, there are just things that people shouldn't have access to read, and that's not the project. So like Emily said, I hope you leave with more thoughts than you had about Wheel of Time. I hope you leave as a bit more of a critical thinker about any media that you engage with. And I hope that you've taken from this that like being a critical thinker and engaging with your media in a critical way is fun and can be silly. It doesn't always have to be sit down and write an essay. Like, both can exist side by side. You can really love something and take a lot of joy and silliness out of it, and it can be objectively bad and problematic.
Yeah, the culture and the sort of atmosphere in which we're operating currently really wants people to look at books and either give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down in the style of Gladiator.
Yeah.
Like, yes, this is worth keeping within the canon. It's worth sharing with children, or however you want to engage with that. And I think, we are fundamentally against that.
Yeah.
We just spent 7 years talking about a series that failed in so many ways.
Yeah.
Yet it was still worth it. It was still valuable, and the series itself is still valuable. Just as all books have their value, just as Nabokov had his value.
Yeah, I think, that's just like the perfect note to end on, especially, and not to keep beating a dead horse, but I'm seeing a lot of stuff around book talk about like authors being like canceled, and there's a variety of reasons not to read people, but it's just like this idea of cancel culture around books in general, and also the idea kind of like what people should and should not write about. R.F. Kuang has this great interview that I've seen around a couple of times of like, it's such a slippery slope to be like, you're too much of one thing to write about this, or you're not enough of another thing to write about that. Like, it just really puts us in this like very identity policing, background policing place. She says it, of course, much more articulately than I am, but that is another thing to just be cautious of as you're going through. Of like, I know we've said it in the past that like maybe Robert Jordan just,
We said it within this podcast.
yeah,
Within this episode.
and within this episode doesn't have the context to write about certain things, and that is true. To some extent, you do have to recognize your limitations. I'm not going to go write a book about Buddhist philosophy because I don't know enough about it. And if I wanted to, I would have to do a lot of extensive research for that to feel like a worthwhile project. And both of those things, you know, those are both true. But in terms of kind of just like broad strokes, let's not put things into this bucket of like what you should and should not write about. I think it just causes more harm than good. Anything to add there? That was also not super coherent at the end.
We've talked for a long time, both within this podcast episode and within the last 7 years. So ultimately, if you stuck with us for any length of time,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Thank you, as always, to Glenna McKenzie for our theme song.
That's our girl.
Came in late into the game.
Yeah.
Not because she was late, but because we really thought we could get away with tub thumping for probably longer than we should have.
Yeah, much longer than we should have in terms of copyright infringement. Thanks, youtube.com.
Thanks to everyone. We are going to do another wrap-up episode. At least that is the plan. We're going to farm some questions from you all if you have any. We would like to hear that. That does mean that there might be another 2-week gap between episodes rather than 1 week, both in order to farm those correctly. And because as we're recording this, next week is American Thanksgiving, which to Columbus, to colonialism, and every other thing, but we have family obligations that will take us away from the recording space for a while.
Yeah, for a minute. So that'll also hopefully give us time to have more coherent thoughts on the questions that you guys ask. It'll also give you time to listen to this, and if there's anything we didn't address or anything specifically you want us to talk more about, that would be good. I don't know what
That'd be great.
That would be great. Thank you guys so much. We'll kind of say our final goodbyes next time, but I'm having a really hard time processing that this project is ending, so I just have to say it a couple times to make it feel real. Thank you for sticking with us. I think this, speaking for myself, and all these like sort of critical engagement things we've been talking about in the last segment of this podcast, I have learned a lot of that because I have done this podcast and I've been engaged in a long-term critical thinking, close reading project. I would not feel the same way. I would be a worse person. I would be worse off as a thinker and as a person if I had not done this podcast. So thank you for sticking with me with all iterations of my brain and my thought process as I sharpened it and became more educated and hopefully a little bit more articulate over the years. Not sure if that's true, but
Yeah, we'll give you our final sort of summation
yeah.
next time.
Yeah, we've talked so much, me in particular.
Oh,
Sorry you have to edit this.
Oh, well, it's gonna be long, you guys.
Just enjoy
Thanks
it.
for sticking with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see you in a couple weeks. Do we sign off?
I guess.
We're in uncharted
We're in
territory.
uncharted waters. We don't know what to do. I will leave you with my niece. I saw her. She's 8 years old. I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and she and her sister and one of her cousins were making cookies, and Liz was being really bossy. And, like, I love Liz Lover. She was being really bossy. And her mom was like, would you be nice to your friends, please? And Liz goes, but I'm the alpha. And me standing above them literally went, oh! Because it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. But I was like, oh no, she's being disciplined. I can't.
Oh. But she's the alpha.
But she's the alpha. And I was like, where do you even know that from?
She watched Teen Wolf, all of it.
That should be, if we were to ever do another podcast, I would posit Teen Wolf.
Yeah, Jesus Christ, speaking of bad finishes.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.